Hi, in this tutorial I'd like to show you how we can produce really nice images with what in reality is a very small number of sub-exposures. Now, most keen astrophotographers like to acquire as much data as is possible, and this usually involves many sets of sub-exposures taken through each of the filters to produce a nice strong data set. The reason for this, of course, as I've covered before in other tutorials, is that by combining a large number of sub-exposures, the signal to noise ratio of an image improves. Basically what happens when you add a lot of sub-exposures together, the signal part of the image, the interesting part if you like, the nebula or the galaxy, the data that makes up these objects, adds in a very linear sense, and yet the noise adds much more slowly. So this is actually a really good thing, and it's why most amateur astrophotographers take lots and lots of sub-exposures to produce a very strong image with a very good signal to noise ratio. But when you're working with data that's taken with high quality instrumentation from prime observing locations around the world, like with the Telescope Live platform, it's possible to produce very good images with a small number of original sub-exposures. I can illustrate this case by using, in this case, images of the North American nebula in Cygnus, which are just taken with a Takahashi FSQ 106 from IC Astronomy in Spain. Now, the data set we'll be working with is literally just made up of two sets of 450 second exposures. So the overall total through each filter will only amount to 15 minutes, so we're talking about less than an hour's worth of exposures. Now, the North American nebula is a very bright target, but even so, when working with, as I say, with good quality instrumentation and from dark locations, the signal to noise ratio is far better than if you're working, for example, in the UK with lots of light pollution and other sort of problems. So what we have on the screen at the moment is literally just a single 450 second exposure of the North American nebula taken through hydrogen alpha filter. Now we can zoom in and have a look at this area here, because this is an interesting part of the nebula. It contains the so-called Cygnus wall, which is one of the brightest parts of the North American nebula. It's got this lovely sort of structural shape to it. But just off to the right of that is an area of dark nebulosity, and this is generally where the noise component tends to creep into the images. So what you see on the screen at the moment, hopefully, the image itself is quite noisy. Now, I've got this as a part of a layered image. If I hide this image now, we'll look at the image that's below it. This is actually the same target, but this time made up of just two 450 second exposures through a hydrogen alpha filter. And what we should be able to see, I hope, is that the noise within this dark nebulosity is just slightly less than on the previous image, but the area of strong signal in the image, this part here, the Cygnus wall, is actually richer compared to just the single exposure. So if I bring the layers menu onto screen, I can show you what I'm doing. I'm just going to click back to the top layer, which is the single exposure, and once again you can see that this part of the nebula is a little bit more grainy perhaps, and this part of the dark nebulosity certainly is, and as we hide that, things start to improve. We can see the signal part is improving and the noise part is as well, but still quite a bit of noise in there, but we can deal with it. So this just illustrates how the addition of more and more sub-exposures starts to improve the image. So for this tutorial, what I'd like to show you now is actually what we call an SHO image, made up using the data that you've just seen on the screen. This time the image is made up of two 450 second exposures for each of the filters. Now for this image, the filters used were hydrogen alpha, sulfur 2 and oxygen 3. And what you're seeing on the screen at the moment is a very green image. Now this is because when we're putting together narrowband images using the so-called Hubble palette, we load the sulfur 2 data into the red channel, the hydrogen alpha data into the green channel and the oxygen 3 data into the blue channel. And because, as we'll certainly see in a minute, hydrogen alpha data is so strong and it's in the green channel, it makes the image very green. Now, I've covered how to produce these SHO or Hubble palette images in earlier tutorials, so I won't dwell too much on that now. But what I will do is talk through some of the procedures that I would use on an image like this to improve it, to make it ready to be combined with the hydrogen alpha data to produce a really strong image. So some of the things I would have done initially would be improve the gradient on the image. You can see that the image is lighter at the bottom than it is at the top, and this is because this image was taken at very close to full moon conditions. So it is a remarkable image, not only because it's made up of such short exposures, because it was taken with the full moon in the sky. And it's degraded the image ever so slightly, but it's nothing that we can't fix quite easily. So I've applied a very useful plugin for Photoshop called Gradient Exterminator, and once that's been done, hopefully you can see how the gradient's now been removed. Then we can apply selective colour to the image, and what that does, it allows us to work on the individual colours within the image to start to change them into the Hubble palette view that we like to look at. The next thing I did was just adjust the levels so that the sky background is a little bit darker. We've still got the very greenish glow to the nebula, but another pass of the selective colour tool has helped address that. What it's done, it's allowed me to show the oxygen 3 component as this lovely bluish colour, and the stronger hydrogen alpha data, which is predominantly the nebula itself, in this nice sort of golden yellow sort of reddish colour. I then used colour balance just to neutralise the background slightly, and then another pass of the selective colour tool. So you can go back and reuse the selective colour tool to improve the image as you go along. And then I've just given it a slight contrast boost, and the image is looking quite good now. If we go back to where we started, this is where we started off. Literally, this was as the image that had just been combined into an SHO image, and we ended up here with what's looking like quite a nice image. So far so good. We can zoom in on the image and start to assess the noise levels now, and as I do that, you should be able to see how this area that we looked at earlier on is quite noisy. This is quite usual, bearing in mind that we're just using a very small set of overall exposure times. But one thing we can do is apply, for example, a tool that I've found very useful in the past. It's part of Photoshop's Camera Raw filter menu, and that's accessed from Filter and then Camera Raw Filter. That'll open this little sub menu up on the screen. We can zoom in and have a look. And as we come down to the right hand side where we have all these different options we can use, the one I'm going to access is the detail menu, which is just found down here. If you just click on the little arrow, it opens up sharpening, noise reduction and colour noise reduction. So the one we're interested in is noise reduction. We can click on the slider and drag that towards the right. Be careful not to push it too far. You can also experiment with the colour noise reduction tool down here. It may or may not help. It seems to be doing quite a good job. And then once you're happy, and you can see this happening in real time, you click on the OK button at the bottom to commit the changes. So let's have a look and see what it's done. Okay, so looks like it's done a fairly good job. I hope you can see that. I'm going to click back one state just to show before that was applied, and yeah, it's done a fairly good job. That smoothed the image out quite nicely. So that's worth bearing in mind. Another option is something I've covered recently, which is a plugin for Photoshop, also a standalone program, called Topaz Denoise AI. And once you've installed it on your computer, it's accessed from within Photoshop under the filter menu, Topaz Labs, and then just Denoise AI. And you'll be familiar with this if you've seen my earlier tutorial on the software, but it just opens the image up on the screen, and you have this slider mechanism which shows you the before on the left and the after on the right. And we can take this slider up a little bit, perhaps try removing a little bit more of the noise, and perhaps take the sharpen slider down. Again, it's when you're using software like this, it's quite intuitive to use, and you can just fine-tune it to suit your own images and your own data. So let's see how that's doing. Yeah, it looks like it's doing quite a good job, as we'd expect. And you click on apply. It takes just a short time for the software to modify the image. We just sit back and wait for that, and then once that's done, it will close down the denoise AI interface, and the image will be saved as a new state, just in the history states. So we can go back and look at the previous state and see how it compares. Yep, that looks quite good. Go back one step. I'll just do this off screen, and certainly in the darker areas here you can see that it's just smoothing that over nicely. So that's quite good. I'm quite happy with that, but what I'm actually going to do now is undo any of the changes that I've just made to demonstrate the denoise routines to you, because I just want to work on this image in its native state. So at the moment it's still quite noisy. When these images were put together, predictably enough, even though the North American Nebula is quite a bright target, it's quite strong in hydrogen alpha, but it's very weak in sulfur 2 and it's very weak in oxygen 3. So what we can do, and again I've covered this in earlier tutorials, we can create a kind of hybrid image using this data. So if you're familiar with how we would create an LRGB image of a galaxy, for example, or a nebula, we'd shoot data through a luminance filter to capture the maximum amount of signal from the object in the sky through this clear luminance filter. Then we'd shoot the RGB data, and we'd blend that RGB image with the luminance data to create an LRGB image. Now we're going to do something similar here, but not quite the same. We're going to use our strong hydrogen alpha data as a luminance frame, and then we'll use the image that we can see on the screen at the moment, which we've just kind of created, as a kind of RGB file, and then we can blend the two together to get a much stronger image. It sounds a bit strange because the final result will be a hydrogen alpha, sulfur 2, hydrogen alpha, oxygen 3 image, which seems a bit kind of half-baked, but honestly it really does work very well, and it works particularly well if you're working with very limited data sets. So to produce this image, what we'll do, we'll work in a 450-second combination image, the hydrogen alpha image of the North American Nebula, and it looks, even with just that small amount of data, very good. It's a lovely evocative target, lots of striations in the dark dust. It's actually part of one big nebula, but it looks as though it's split in half, because what we have here is dividing dust in the foreground, which is just blotting out the light of the nebula behind. But it is a lovely target. So what we're going to do is, first of all, convert this into an RGB image, and we do that. It's very quick and easy to do. It's image, mode, and then come down to RGB colour. And the reason we have to do this, and I've covered this in earlier tutorials, is to allow us to now paste our colour data on top. So we come back to the image that we've just produced. We can do select all, edit, copy, and I'll just do a quick deselect, and back to our hydrogen alpha image, and I'm going to do Control V to paste the image on top. The first thing we have to do is just check the alignment, and we do that by changing the opacity up here down to about 50% or 51%, usually works quite well, and we need to be happy that these images are perfectly aligned, and it looks like they are, so I'll just undo the change that I've made. That looks absolutely fine. Remember, of course, to change the opacity back up to 100%. And the next thing we do is to come up to where it says normal, because this is where we find all our different blending options, and click on that, and then right down at the bottom is colour. And click on that, and what that will do is to produce this equivalent of an LRGB image. So once again, just to reiterate, it's a hydrogen alpha image as the base layer, and on the top is the newly created sulfur 2 hydrogen alpha oxygen 3 SHO Hubble palette image. Now these two are just kind of sort of blended together now, and this is great. Now the reason why I previously didn't apply any noise reduction to it is that there's a technique you can use which works particularly well if you're working with very short data sets, and that's to actually apply a gentle blur to the colour data. And the blur that I use is found under the filter menu. It's filter, blur, and then come across to Gaussian blur, and a value of let's go right up to 3 this time, because it's quite a noisy image as we would expect. I've got 3.1, that's fine. And click on OK, and that should help smooth some of the noise out in the image. You can now save it as a Photoshop layered image, but for brevity what I'll do is I'll just flatten the image down into a single layer under it's under layer, flatten image. And so we've lost our layer structure, so I'll take the layers menu back off the screen now, and we can come back to our newly created hybrid image. Now we can zoom in, and okay, still a little bit of noise in there, so we can once again just revisit some of those tools that we worked with earlier on when we were just working with the SHO image. So I'll just do that very quickly, we can see how it works. We'll go into Photoshop's camera raw menu again, and then come down to noise reduction. Just take this up a little bit. We can zoom in just to be sure that we're not overdoing this, and a little bit of colour noise reduction as well. Yeah, it's looking quite good, and then we can just click on OK. Looks like it's done a fairly good job. Of course, you can also use Topaz Denoise AI. I demonstrated that earlier on, so I won't go back and do it now. We'll work with Photoshop's noise reduction. That seems to have worked okay. And then perhaps we can just do a final tweak to get the image really nice and sparkling. It's a good idea to call up Photoshop's Levels menu and check that we haven't clipped the data. I made it jet black in the sky background. That's really a bad thing to do to an image, and you can tell whether it's clipped or not because the effect you would see if it was clipped, when you called up the layers menu, it would look like this, all the pixels kind of scrunched up to the left hand side, and that's telling us that we're losing quality data here because it's just been reverted to black. So we definitely don't want to do that, so I'll just undo that off screen. We'll go back to our layers, and we can just darken the sky background a tad. Just bring this down roughly to where the histogram starts to rise up, and we can click OK. And then once again we can come into Photoshop's selective colour menu. I've got a shortcut set up for that, it's just Control K. This is the selective colour menu we've alluded to earlier on, and the idea is once again you have all these different colours here. I tend to ignore these last 3, but starting off with the red, you literally drag the slider really to positions where you're happy with your data. So it's fairly arbitrary, it's your data, so it's up to you how you actually process it. Once you're happy with the reds, we can go on to the yellows. Take this down, yeah, it's looking quite good. Don't go too far with that, yeah, it's looking good. Next onto the greens. Probably not going to make too much difference because we sort of processed out a lot of those greens from the image earlier. Yeah, so looking good. We're starting to pick up some nice structure within the nebula itself. Yeah, we'll go with that, that's fine. Cyans, you can boost the blue if you wish, or you can take it down. It's entirely up to you. I'll just make it a little bit bluer as we're taking that down. And one final little tweak just on the blue. It's up to you how strong you make this. Yeah, it's not looking too bad. Doesn't need much more doing to it, to be honest. Just take that down and we'll click on OK. So the changes may be subtle. Off screen, just click back one state. Yeah, it's just kind of tidied that up a little bit. So it's looking really good. We can be pleased with that for such a short data set. and there's plenty more processing you can do to this, but the thing to just always keep an eye on is the noise. So we still have a little bit of graininess here in the sky background, but now, for example, the Cygnus wall is looking quite good, and there's all sorts of further processing you can apply, which I've covered in other tutorials, which may just give this a little bit of extra sparkle. I'd certainly be very happy with this image, and if you remember where we came in at the beginning of the tutorial, this was our image that had been just combined as an SHO image, and we've now ended up with this. It's exactly the same amount of data. All we've done is we've been a little bit careful to keep the background levels good. We've used the selective colour to just tweak the colours into a much more pleasing palette. I think one final thing I'll do, we've got a little bit of glow up here. I think I'll just do a small crop on the image just to keep that looking good, and yeah, I think we can stick with that. We're happy with that data. So I hope this has been of use to you for working with these very small data sets, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.